At 35, you're past your prime, Rosalind. No man wants damaged goods. My husband Bryce said this while his 22-year-old mistress giggled behind him. I signed the divorce papers without a single tear. 3 months later, at their engagement celebration, I walked in with my divorce lawyer, my brilliant young nephew Jamie. Antoinette took one look at him and forgot Bryce existed.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Congratulations, I said, sliding the custody papers across the table. Jamie here specializes in age discrimination lawsuits. Your company's going to love explaining why they promoted a man who calls women damaged goods to other employees. Bryce's face went white when he realized I'd recorded everything. Antoinette was already asking Jamie for his number. But let me take you back to where this all began, because the truth is, I should have seen it coming long before that devastating night at Chez Laurent, when Bryce decided to demolish 20 years of marriage between the appetizer and main course. The signs had been there for months. Bryce Popplewell had always been particular about appearances. It's what made him successful in corporate consulting. But lately, his attention to his own appearance had become almost obsessive. New suits tailored to perfection, a personal trainer he met with at dawn, cologne that smelled nothing like the familiar scent I'd grown to love over our 8 years of marriage. At 38, he was having what I generously called a renewal phase. What I didn't realize was that his renewal required my complete erasure. I should mention that our life in Portland was everything we'd planned when we married. The Victorian house in the Alberta Arts District that we'd painstakingly restored together, weekend trips to Hood River for wine tasting, season tickets to the Portland Opera that we'd maintained even when money was tight during his early consulting years. I worked as a textile conservator at the Portland Art Museum, specializing in 19th century fabrics, work that was precise, detailed, and required the kind of patience that apparently made me boring in Bryce's evolving worldview. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was cataloging a collection of Civil War-era quilts that had been donated by the Gilmore family estate, my hands carefully measuring the intricate stitching patterns that told stories of women who had worked by candlelight to create beauty in the midst of tragedy. There's something profound about touching fabric that was handled by women over a century ago, feeling the echo of their lives in every careful stitch. Still playing with old blankets, I see, Bryce said, appearing in my workshop doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. Not affection, not even mild interest, but something closer to disdain. These aren't blankets, I replied, not looking up from my work. This particular piece was made in 1863 by a woman named Clara Nelson. She documented the pattern in letters to her sister. It's remarkable craftsmanship. Right, he said, his voice carrying that dismissive tone he usually reserved for incompetent vendors. Well, some of us have real work to do. Real work, as if my master's degree in art conservation, my 15 years of experience, my contributions to academic journals, and my role in preserving cultural heritage for future generations somehow didn't qualify as real work. I should have called him out then, should have demanded he explain what he meant. Instead, I watched him walk away and felt something cold settle in my chest. The second incident happened 3 weeks later at the annual museum gala. I'd spent weeks coordinating with the fundraising team, had written the descriptions for the catalog, and had personally overseen the installation of our featured exhibition on Pacific Northwest textile traditions. The evening was a success by every measure. We raised over $200,000, received commitments for 3 major loans from private collectors, and garnered coverage in both the Oregonian and Portland Monthly. I was standing near the display case containing a Chinook ceremonial robe from 1890, explaining its cultural significance to the mayor's wife, when I heard Bryce's laugh from across the room. Not his genuine laugh, but the performative one he used at networking events. Curious, I glanced over and saw him talking to a cluster of young professionals, all of them at least a decade younger than us. My wife's the expert on old things, he was saying, gesturing vaguely in my direction. She can tell you everything you never wanted to know about thread count and fabric decay. Me, I prefer to focus on the future. The group laughed politely, but I caught the way one young woman, blonde, impossibly thin, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's rent, looked at him with obvious interest. She couldn't have been older than 25, and she was staring at Bryce like he was the most fascinating man she'd ever encountered. Later, when I mentioned feeling uncomfortable about his comment, Bryce dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're being too sensitive, Roz. It was just a joke. Everyone knows I respect your work." But respect felt like the wrong word for what I'd witnessed. Respect doesn't mock someone's life passion at a professional event. Respect doesn't reduce 15 years of expertise to a punchline for networking entertainment. The third and final warning came in November, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. We were having dinner at home, one of our increasingly rare evenings together, when Bryce looked up from his phone, which he'd been checking throughout the meal, and studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know what I was thinking today?" he said, setting down his fork. "Remember when we first met at that gallery opening? You were wearing that red dress, the one with the vintage buttons." I remembered. It had been my favorite dress, a 1940s piece I'd found at an estate sale and carefully restored. I'd felt confident that night, beautiful even. "You looked so young then," he continued, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been nostalgia or might have been regret. "So fresh." Fresh, as if I were produce with an expiration date. "I was 27, I said carefully, 8 years ago." "Right, 27. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through what looked like Instagram photos. It's funny how time changes things. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand why he was looking at me like I was a puzzle he'd grown tired of solving. Instead, I cleared the dishes and told myself he was just feeling nostalgic, that this phase would pass like all the others. But time doesn't change things. People do. And Bryce had been changing in ways I was only beginning to understand. While I had been focused on preserving the past, documenting history, and maintaining the traditions that connected us to previous generations, he had been actively rejecting everything that reminded him of the passage of time, including me. The revelation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage was still 2 months away, but as I stood in our kitchen that November evening, watching my husband scroll through images of people who had barely lived long enough to have histories worth preserving, I felt the first real stirring of something I'd never experienced in our relationship before: doubt. Looking back now, I realize how carefully constructed our life had been. Not by fate or natural progression, but by my own deliberate choices to create what I thought was happiness. Every detail of our existence had been curated like one of my museum exhibitions, each element chosen to support a narrative I desperately wanted to believe. Our house on Northeast Prescott Street was a testament to that curation. We'd bought it 5 years earlier when Bryce's consulting firm, Popplewell Strategic Solutions, had finally turned profitable. The 1904 Victorian had been a disaster when we found it. Sagging porch, rotting window frames, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. But I saw its potential the moment I walked through the front door. "It's a money pit," Bryce had said during our first viewing, running his finger along a windowsill and coming away with a handful of paint chips. "We should look at something newer, something that won't require constant maintenance." But I was already envisioning the restoration, the way the morning light would stream through the original stained glass when properly cleaned, the warmth of the hardwood floors once they were refinished to their natural state, the possibility of turning the third-floor attic into a proper study where I could work on my research projects. "It has good bones," I'd told him, borrowing the phrase my grandmother used to use when evaluating antique furniture. "Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that have been forgotten for a while." Bryce had looked at me then with what I interpreted as admiration. "That's exactly why I love you, Roz. You see treasure where other people see junk. Over the next 3 years, we'd transform that house into something magazine-worthy.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I coordinated every detail of the renovation myself, working with local craftsmen to preserve the original architectural elements while adding modern conveniences. The kitchen featured custom cabinets that matched the home's period with hand-forged hardware I'd found at an estate sale in Seattle. The master bedroom showcased a collection of vintage textiles I'd acquired over years of careful hunting, quilts, embroidered linens, and a 19th century coverlet that had belonged to a pioneering Oregon family. Every room told a story, and every story reflected our shared aesthetic vision. Or so I thought. Bryce's home office occupied the entire second-floor front room, with built-in bookshelves I'd designed to house his collection of business books and consulting manuals. His desk, a restored 1920s banker's piece, faced the street so he could watch the neighborhood's daily rhythms while working. I'd chosen every element to reflect success and sophistication. The leather chair from a Portland antique dealer, the Persian rug that had belonged to my great-aunt, the brass lamp with a green glass shade that provided perfect task lighting. "It's like working in a gentleman's club from the 1890s, he'd said when I finished the room, and his pleasure had filled me with satisfaction. I was creating not just a home, but an environment that supported his ambitions and reflected his growing status in Portland's business community. My own workspace occupied a corner of the basement that I'd converted into a conservation studio. It wasn't glamorous: concrete floors, utility lighting, temperature and humidity controls that made it feel more like a laboratory than an artist's retreat. But it was functional and completely mine. Here, I could spread out textile samples, set up photography equipment for documentation, and maintain the precise environmental conditions necessary for working with historical fabrics. Bryce rarely came down to my studio. "Too technical for me," he'd say when I'd try to share exciting discoveries about provenance or construction techniques. "I'll leave the history to you and focus on the future." At the time, I thought this division made sense. We each had our expertise, our separate spheres of influence that complemented rather than competed with each other. He built businesses and solved strategic problems for corporate clients. I preserved cultural heritage and solved historical puzzles about how our ancestors lived and worked. Together, we were creating a life that honored both progress and tradition. Our social life reflected this same careful balance. Bryce's business colleagues would join us for dinner parties where I'd prepare elaborate meals featuring locally sourced ingredients served on vintage china I'd collected over the years. My museum friends would attend gallery openings and cultural events where Bryce would charm everyone with his knowledge of wine and his ability to discuss everything from jazz history to urban planning with equal enthusiasm. "You two are like Portland royalty," our friend Marianne Grant had said at a party last spring, gesturing with her wine glass toward our beautifully appointed dining room where guests were examining a display of historical photographs I'd assembled showing the evolution of our neighborhood. "You've created something really special here." I'd felt proud that night, watching Bryce hold court near the fireplace while a small group listened to his theories about the city's economic development. He looked handsome in the soft light, his dark hair showing just enough silver at the temples to suggest wisdom without age, his smile encompassing everyone in the room with warmth and attention. This was the man I'd married: intelligent, charismatic, someone who could make anyone feel like the most interesting person in the room. But even then, there were moments that should have concerned me. The way his attention lingered on younger women at parties, his increasing tendency to interrupt me when I spoke about my work, the subtle eye rolls when I'd get enthusiastic about a new acquisition or discovery. Rosalind could talk for hours about thread patterns, he'd said to a group at that same party, his tone affectionate but dismissive. "Lucky for you, I've learned when to change the subject before you all fall asleep." Everyone had laughed, including me, because it seemed harmless at the time. Couples tease each other, partners develop shorthand for managing social situations. I told myself that Bryce was simply helping keep conversations lively and accessible. What I didn't recognize was the pattern, how he consistently positioned himself as the dynamic, forward-thinking partner while characterizing me as the academic specialist with narrow, potentially boring interests. How he claimed credit for our home's aesthetic success while dismissing the expertise that had made it possible. How he'd begun treating my professional accomplishments as charming hobbies rather than serious work. The most telling moment had come just 6 months earlier at a fundraising dinner for the museum. I'd been invited to speak briefly about our upcoming exhibition on women's textile traditions in the Pacific Northwest, a project I'd spent 2 years researching and organizing. The presentation went well. I felt confident and articulate, and the audience seemed genuinely engaged with both the historical information and the contemporary relevance of preserving these traditions. Afterward, as we mingled during the cocktail reception, several attendees approached me with follow-up questions and congratulations. Dr. Hans Jerome, the museum director, pulled me aside to express his satisfaction with both my presentation and the broader project. "Outstanding work, Rosalind," he'd said. "This exhibition is going to put us on the map nationally. I've already had calls from colleagues in San Francisco and Denver asking about potential traveling versions." I was glowing with professional pride when Bryce appeared at my elbow, his hand settling possessively on my lower back. "Hope she wasn't too technical for everyone," he'd said to Dr. Jerome with a conspiratorial smile. "I keep telling her that not everyone shares her obsession with 19th century needlework, but she gets carried away." The comment stung, but what bothered me more was Dr. Jerome's expression, a flicker of confusion, as if he couldn't quite reconcile Bryce's dismissive tone with the expertise I'd just demonstrated. In that moment, I saw my own husband through a colleague's eyes, and what I saw wasn't attractive. But I pushed the discomfort aside, as I had learned to do with increasing frequency. Marriage requires compromise, I told myself. Not everyone can be passionate about the same things. Bryce supported my career in practical ways. He'd never asked me to give up my work, never complained about the modest salary compared to his growing income, never pressured me to focus on more lucrative pursuits. That support felt generous, even progressive, in a world where many successful men expected their wives to function as full-time accessories to their ambitions. I was grateful for the freedom to pursue work I loved, and I told myself that gratitude should override any concerns about his public presentation of that work. What I failed to recognize was how gradually the dismissiveness had escalated, how systematically he'd begun undermining my confidence and positioning me as a supporting character in the life we built together. By the time I understood what was happening, the foundation of everything I'd believed about our relationship had already begun to crack. What Bryce never bothered to learn about me, even after 8 years of marriage, was that my expertise in textile conservation had given me skills far beyond what he dismissively called playing with old blankets. The work required not just historical knowledge, but chemistry, photography, legal research, and an understanding of provenance documentation that would make any detective proud. More importantly, it had connected me to a network of collectors, historians, and legal experts who specialized in cultural property law, connections that would prove invaluable in ways I couldn't have imagined during those peaceful years when I thought our biggest challenge was choosing paint colors for the guest bedroom. My family history was something else Bryce had never fully grasped, perhaps because I'd never felt the need to emphasize it. The Gilmore name carried weight in certain circles, particularly in Oregon legal and academic communities, though not in the flashy way that impressed corporate consultants. My grandfather, Judge Edmund Gilmore, had been a respected figure in the state court system for over 30 decades. My father, Professor Marcus Gilmore, had taught constitutional law at Lewis and Clark for 40 years before his retirement. And my younger sister Elena had followed the family tradition by becoming one of Portland's most successful family law attorneys. But the family connection that would matter most in the coming months was my nephew Jamie Jerome, Elena's son, who had somehow managed to graduate from law school at 24 and pass the bar at 25, making him the youngest practicing attorney in his firm's history. Jamie had what Elena diplomatically called an unusual relationship with time. He'd graduated high school at 16, finished his undergraduate degree at Stanford in 3 years, and completed law school at Northwestern in record time while simultaneously earning a master's degree in business administration. He makes the rest of us look like underachievers, Elena had joked at Christmas dinner the year before, watching her son explain some complex legal precedent to my father with the kind of clarity that made difficult concepts seem obvious. Sometimes I think he downloaded the entire legal code directly into his brain. Jamie had joined Morrison Blake and Associates straight out of law school, and despite his youth, had quickly earned a reputation for brilliance in family law cases, particularly those involving complex asset division and business valuation. His specialty was what other lawyers called impossible cases, divorces where one spouse had hidden assets, manipulated business valuations, or otherwise attempted to game the system. At 26, he already commanded fees that reflected his unusual success rate. What made Jamie particularly effective wasn't just his legal knowledge, but his appearance. He looked nothing like the stereotype of a ruthless divorce attorney. Tall and lean with dark hair and his father's Italian features, he could have been mistaken for a graduate student or tech entrepreneur. His youth and good looks often led opposing parties to underestimate him, a mistake they typically made only once. People see a young face and assume inexperience, Jamie had told me during one of our family gatherings. By the time they realize what they're dealing with, I've already documented everything they thought they were hiding. I'd always been proud of my nephew's achievements, but I'd never imagined needing his professional services. The Gilmore family valued stability and longevity in relationships. My parents had been married for 52 years before my father's death. Elena and her husband had just celebrated their 30th anniversary. Divorce was something that happened to other families, not to us. Beyond my family connections, I possessed something else that Bryce had never recognized as valuable, an extensive network of professional relationships built over 15 years in museum work. Textile conservation is a small field, and those of us who specialize in it know each other across institutions and continents. We collaborate on research projects, share information about techniques and discoveries, and maintain relationships that transcend the usual academic boundaries. Dr. Louisa Armand, for instance, had been my mentor during graduate school and was now chief curator at the Seattle Art Museum. She'd been instrumental in helping me secure several major acquisitions for Portland, and we'd maintained both a professional relationship and personal friendship over the years. What Bryce didn't know was that Louisa's ex-husband was a forensic accountant who specialized in investigating corporate fraud, or that she'd gone through her own brutal divorce 5 years earlier when she discovered her husband had been systematically stealing from his clients' accounts. Never trust a man who thinks your work isn't important, she'd told me during one of our regular phone calls, though at the time I hadn't understood why she felt compelled to offer that advice. Men who dismiss what we do usually have something to hide themselves. Then there was my friendship with Edith Nelson, a private investigator who specialized in insurance fraud, but had started taking domestic cases after her own marriage ended badly. We'd met during a case involving stolen historical artifacts where my expertise in textile identification helped her prove that a collector was selling forgeries while claiming insurance money for the stolen originals. Edith had been impressed enough with my analytical skills to suggest I consider a career change, though I'd laughed off the suggestion at the time. "You've got a natural talent for documentation and evidence preservation," she'd said. "Plus, you notice details that other people miss. Those are exactly the skills that matter in my line of work." I'd maintained contact with Edith over the years, occasionally helping her authenticate pieces for other cases. She'd often mentioned that her domestic investigation work had expanded dramatically as more people began to suspect their spouses of financial infidelity. "Cheating hearts usually come with cheating finances," was her standard observation. "People who lie about one thing generally lie about everything." Perhaps most importantly, my work in textile conservation had taught me patience and the value of careful documentation. Every piece I worked with required detailed photography, chemical analysis, and historical research. I was accustomed to building cases based on evidence, to supporting conclusions with multiple sources of documentation, and to presenting findings in ways that would withstand scholarly scrutiny. These skills had become second nature over the years. The careful recording of observations, the systematic organization of information, the ability to trace connections between seemingly unrelated elements. What I hadn't realized was how directly applicable they would be to documenting the dissolution of a marriage. The final hidden strength I possessed was something Bryce had actively encouraged me to develop, though not for the reasons that would eventually matter. 3 years earlier, when his business had expanded and our social obligations had increased, he'd suggested I hire a personal assistant to help manage our household and social calendar. "You're spending too much time on mundane tasks," he'd said. "We can afford help now, and it would free you up to focus on your real work." The assistant I'd hired was Antoinette Grant, a 22-year-old recent graduate from Portland State who was working part-time while applying to graduate programs in arts administration. She was bright, organized, and remarkably efficient at managing the complex logistics of our increasingly busy social life. What I hadn't anticipated was how comfortable she would become in our home, or how much she would learn about our personal and financial arrangements through her access to mail, phone calls, and casual conversations. Antoinette had been working for us for over 2 years by the time Bryce's behavior began to change dramatically. She'd seen him during his early morning workouts, had answered calls from his business associates, and had organized his travel arrangements for client meetings. More significantly, she'd observed the shift in how he spoke to me, the increasing frequency of his critical comments, and the growing tension in our household. "Mrs. Popplewell," she'd said to me one afternoon in early December, her voice carefully neutral, "I wanted to let you know that Mr. Popplewell asked me not to mention his Thursday evening appointments anymore. He said they were confidential client meetings and that you didn't need to be bothered with the details." The comment had seemed odd at the time, but not alarming. Bryce's consulting work often involved sensitive corporate information, and I'd learned not to pry into the specifics of his client relationships. What I didn't realize was that Antoinette's training in arts administration had included coursework in nonprofit management and legal compliance, skills that had taught her to recognize when situations might require documentation. Unknown to me, she had begun keeping detailed records of these confidential appointments, including dates, times, and the fact that they always seemed to occur at the same downtown address. She'd also noted the changes in Bryce's behavior following these meetings, the guilt-induced gifts that appeared without occasion, the defensive reactions to casual questions about his schedule, and the increasing criticism of everything related to our home and relationship. "Mrs. Popplewell," she'd said to me one afternoon in early December, her voice carefully neutral, "I wanted to let you know that Mr. Popplewell asked me not to mention his Thursday evening appointments anymore. He said they were confidential client meetings and that you didn't need to be bothered with the details." The comment had seemed odd at the time, but not alarming. Bryce's consulting work often involved sensitive corporate information, and I'd learned not to pry into the specifics of his client relationships. What I didn't realize was that Antoinette's training in arts administration had included coursework in nonprofit management and legal compliance, skills that had taught her to recognize when situations might require documentation. Unknown to me, she had begun keeping detailed records of these confidential appointments, including dates, times, and the fact that they always seemed to occur at the same downtown address. She'd also noted the changes in Bryce's behavior following these meetings, the guilt-induced gifts that appeared without occasion, the defensive reactions to casual questions about his schedule, and the increasing criticism of everything related to our home and relationship. By December, I possessed all the resources necessary to protect myself from whatever storm was approaching, though I had no idea they would be needed. I had family members with legal expertise, professional contacts with investigative experience, and a household assistant who was inadvertently documenting evidence of my husband's growing deception. What I lacked was any understanding of how urgent that protection would become. The first real evidence that my marriage was in serious trouble came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in January, though I didn't recognize it as evidence at the time. I was working late in my basement studio, cataloging a collection of 1920s beaded evening gowns that had been donated by the estate of a prominent Portland socialite. The work required intense concentration. Each bead had to be photographed and documented before cleaning, and several of the pieces showed signs of deterioration that would require delicate restoration. I'd been so absorbed in examining a particularly intricate Art Deco pattern that I didn't hear Bryce come home, didn't notice the sound of his footsteps on the floor above, didn't register anything unusual until I heard voices in the kitchen, plural voices. Bryce's familiar baritone and a higher, distinctly feminine laugh that definitely didn't belong to any of our usual visitors. Curious rather than suspicious, I set down my magnifying glass and climbed the stairs to see who had stopped by so late. What I found when I reached the kitchen doorway made me freeze in confusion. Bryce was standing near the island, still wearing his business suit, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up in a way that looked casually intimate rather than professionally disheveled. Across from him, perched on one of our vintage bar stools like she belonged there, was a young woman I'd never seen before. She couldn't have been older than 25, with platinum blonde hair styled in beachy waves and wearing a tight black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They were drinking wine from our good glasses, the Baccarat crystal we usually reserved for special occasions, and the atmosphere between them felt charged in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden understanding. "Oh," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "I didn't realize we were expecting company." Both of them turned toward me, and I caught something in their expressions, surprise, guilt, and what might have been annoyance, before Bryce's face smoothed into his professional smile. "Roz, perfect timing," he said, though his tone suggested my timing was anything but perfect. "I'd like you to meet Antoinette Blake. She's been helping me with some consulting work for her father's company. Antoinette, this is my wife, Rosalind." The young woman slid gracefully off the bar stool and extended a perfectly manicured hand. "So nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Popplewell. Bryce has told me so much about your work at the museum." Her handshake was firm, her smile bright and seemingly genuine, but something about the way she said "finally" suggested she'd been hearing about me for longer than a brief consulting arrangement would warrant. And there was something else, a familiarity in how she moved through our kitchen, reaching for a napkin from the counter as if she knew exactly where everything was kept. "Blake," I repeated, trying to place the name. "Are you related to Morrison, Blake and Associates?" "My uncle's firm," she confirmed with obvious pride, "though I'm on the business side rather than legal. MBA from Wharton, focusing on strategic consulting for family-owned enterprises." Impressive credentials, I had to admit, though she looked barely old enough to have completed an undergraduate degree, let alone an MBA from one of the country's top business schools. But then again, some people were simply gifted with unusual intelligence and drive. My own nephew Jamie was proof that exceptional minds could accomplish remarkable things at young ages. "We're working on a fascinating project," Bryce continued, his enthusiasm seeming forced. "Antoinette's father owns a chain of boutique hotels in the Pacific Northwest, and they're looking to expand into the luxury market. Right up my alley in terms of strategic positioning and brand development." "How exciting," I said, though I was wondering why this business discussion was taking place in our kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening, complete with expensive wine and an atmosphere that felt decidedly non-professional. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Antoinette said quickly. "We were just wrapping up anyway. I should probably head home, early morning tomorrow." But she made no move to gather her purse or coat, instead settling back onto the bar stool, as if preparing to continue their conversation. The contradiction between her words and actions sent another spike of unease through my chest. "Actually, before you go," Bryce said, refilling her wine glass without asking if she wanted more, "I wanted to get your thoughts on that market analysis we discussed, the one about demographic shifts and luxury travel spending." For the next 20 minutes, I stood in my own kitchen, listening to my husband and this young woman discuss business strategies with an intimacy that suggested they'd been working together for months rather than the few weeks Bryce had implied. They referenced previous conversations, shared inside jokes about industry trends, and displayed a level of comfort with each other that made me feel like an intruder in my own home. What bothered me most wasn't the late hour or even the unexpected visitor. It was the way Bryce looked at her when she spoke, with attention and interest I hadn't seen him direct toward me in months. His body language was engaged, leaning forward slightly when she made points, laughing at comments that weren't particularly funny, asking follow-up questions that suggested genuine fascination with her opinions. When had he stopped looking at me that way? When had I become background noise in conversations that happened in the home I'd created? "The generational divide is really the key factor," Antoinette was saying, gesturing with her wine glass in a way that made her diamond bracelet catch the light. Millennials and Gen Z travelers want authenticity and experience over traditional luxury markers. They'll pay premium prices, but only for things that feel genuine and unique.
Exactly what I've been trying to tell the hotel industry for years, Bryce agreed. They're still thinking like it's 1995, competing on thread count and marble bathrooms, instead of understanding that today's luxury consumers want stories and connections. I found myself studying this young woman more carefully, trying to understand what about her had captured my husband's attention so completely. She was undeniably attractive, but Portland was full of beautiful young women. Her intelligence was obvious, but Bryce worked with plenty of smart people. What was it about Antoinette Blake that had him hanging on her every word? The answer became clearer as I watched their interaction continue. She wasn't just smart and attractive, she was utterly focused on him. Every comment she made seemed designed to showcase her understanding of his ideas, her appreciation for his expertise, her excitement about his strategic insights. She was performing admiration with the skill of a seasoned professional, and Bryce was absorbing it like a man who'd been wandering in the desert and suddenly found an oasis. "I should probably let you two get back to your evening," I said finally, unable to watch any more of this performance. "Nice meeting you, Antoinette." "The pleasure was mine," she replied, though her attention was already shifting back to Bryce. "Same time next week?" "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "I'll have those projections ready for your review." As I headed back toward the basement stairs, I caught the sound of their laughter resuming, intimate and exclusive. Whatever was happening between them went far beyond professional collaboration, and Bryce's explanation had been carefully constructed to provide plausible deniability while revealing nothing of substance. Back in my studio, surrounded by the elegant remnants of a bygone era, I tried to focus on my work. But the beaded gowns that had seemed so fascinating an hour earlier now felt like artifacts from a different world, a time when marriages lasted, when people honored their commitments, when women my age weren't discarded for younger models with fresher faces and more enthusiastic appreciation. I picked up my camera to document a particularly intricate section of beadwork, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. The first crack had appeared in the foundation of everything I'd believed about my life, and I could feel the structure beginning to shift in ways that terrified me. The logical part of my mind insisted I was overreacting. Bryce had explained the situation. Antoinette Blake was a client, nothing more. The wine and intimate atmosphere were just the byproducts of a business relationship that had developed into professional friendship. Successful consultants often form close working relationships with their clients. There was nothing inherently suspicious about any of it. But the woman in me, the wife who had spent 8 years learning to read my husband's moods and motivations, knew better. The energy between them had been electric in a way that had nothing to do with business strategy and everything to do with attraction, possibility, and the intoxicating thrill of secrets shared between people who were pretending they weren't crossing lines they both knew they shouldn't cross. I set down my camera and stared at the beaded dress spread across my work table. The woman who had worn this gown 70 years ago probably believed her marriage would last forever, too. She'd probably trusted her husband's explanations and given him the benefit of the doubt when situations seemed questionable. She'd probably told herself that love and commitment were stronger than temptation and opportunity. But here was her dress, donated to a museum by strangers because there was no family left who cared enough to preserve her memory. All that remained of her story were the beautiful things she'd once worn, now serving as educational artifacts for people studying the fashion and culture of a distant past. I wondered what artifacts of my own life would survive if everything I'd built fell apart. The house we'd restored together, the collections I'd assembled, the careful curation of a life that suddenly felt as fragile as the century-old beadwork spread before me. The first crack had appeared, and I could already feel the spreading fractures beginning to undermine everything I'd thought was solid and permanent. The weeks following that uncomfortable kitchen encounter settled into a pattern of careful avoidance and mounting tension. Bryce began working longer hours, or at least claiming to work longer hours, while I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The subtle changes in his routine, the new cologne that appeared on his dresser, the way he'd started checking his phone during dinner with the secretive intensity of a teenager hiding something from his parents.
I didn't confront him immediately because I wasn't sure what exactly I'd be confronting him about. A late business meeting with an attractive client? Professional collaboration that had extended into personal friendship? None of these things were inherently wrong, and I didn't want to become the suspicious wife who saw threats in every interaction. But the doubt, once planted, grew with the persistence of an invasive species. Every working late text message felt potentially deceptive. Every mention of the Blake account made me wonder what wasn't being mentioned. Every evening he came home energized and talkative about his work, I found myself analyzing his enthusiasm for signs of artificial performance. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in early February. I'd spent the day at the museum working with a visiting textile expert from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, Dr. Margaret Ashworth, who was in Portland to examine our collection of 19th century American quilts. The collaboration had been intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding, exactly the kind of work that reminded me why I'd chosen this career path. I arrived home feeling accomplished and eager to share the day's discoveries with Bryce. Dr. Ashworth had identified several pieces in our collection as potentially significant examples of a particular quilting tradition that had been thought to be lost. The implications for our upcoming exhibition were exciting, and I was looking forward to discussing the findings with someone who understood the importance of such discoveries. But when I walked into our house, I found it empty, except for a note on the kitchen counter written in Bryce's rushed handwriting. "Emergency client meeting. Will be late. Don't wait up." The note itself wasn't unusual. Bryce's consulting work often involved crisis management, and emergency meetings were part of the territory. What bothered me was the lack of specificity. Which client? What kind of emergency? When might he return? In the past, he'd always provided more context, if only because he knew I worried when his schedule changed unexpectedly. I called his office number and got voicemail. His cell phone went straight to voicemail as well. Neither response was particularly concerning on its own. If he was truly in an emergency meeting, he wouldn't be answering personal calls. But combined with everything else I'd been noticing, the silence felt deliberate rather than circumstantial. That's when I decided to do something I'd never done before in 8 years of marriage. I started looking for evidence. It wasn't premeditated investigation, more like confused curiosity that gradually became systematic examination. I started with his home office, not searching through private documents, but simply observing the space with the same careful attention I brought to my museum work. What story did this room tell about the person who worked here? The first thing I noticed was how clean everything looked. Bryce had never been particularly organized, but his desk was now clear of the usual scattered papers and reference books. His appointment calendar, which he'd always left open on his desk, was nowhere to be seen. The bulletin board, where he typically pinned important reminders and client information, had been stripped of everything except a few generic business cards and a calendar showing only the current month. It was the office of someone who had something to hide. I moved to his dresser in our bedroom, not to snoop through his belongings, but to observe the same kinds of changes. New cologne, as I'd noticed before, but also new undershirts, new socks, and a level of attention to grooming supplies that suggested someone was taking unusual care with his appearance. The man I'd married had always been neat and professional, but this was different. This was the grooming routine of someone who was trying to impress someone specific. My phone buzzed with a text message from Antoinette Grant, our household assistant. "Mrs. Popplewell, should I confirm Mr. Popplewell's dinner reservation at Le Pigeon for tomorrow night? The restaurant called to verify the party of 2 at 8 p.m. I stared at the message in confusion. Bryce hadn't mentioned dinner plans for Saturday night, and Le Pigeon was one of Portland's most romantic restaurants, not the kind of place you'd choose for a business dinner or casual meal with friends. More importantly, if he'd made reservations for 2 people, why hadn't he told me about them? I called Antoinette directly. "I'm sorry, I don't know anything about dinner reservations tomorrow night. Are you sure they were calling about Bryce's reservation?" "That's what they said," she replied, her voice careful. "The hostess specifically asked to confirm the reservation for Bryce Popplewell, party of 2, tomorrow at 8. I assumed it was a surprise for you, but when she asked about dietary restrictions, she mentioned that the second guest had already called to request no shellfish in any of the courses. The detail hit me like cold water. I was allergic to shellfish, but I'd never called a restaurant to make special requests. If Bryce had made reservations for us, he would have mentioned my allergy when booking. The fact that someone else had called suggested he was planning to dine with someone who had different dietary needs entirely. Did the restaurant mention who made the dietary restriction request? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. A young woman, apparently. The hostess said she was very specific about the request and seemed familiar with the menu. After hanging up, I sat in our bedroom trying to process what I'd learned. Bryce was planning a romantic dinner at one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants with someone who wasn't his wife. Someone who was young, familiar with upscale dining, and comfortable making detailed arrangements for their evening together. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. The emergency meeting that had kept him out on a Friday night, the secretive behavior and cleaned-up office, the romantic dinner reservation he'd made without mentioning it to me, the careful attention to his appearance and grooming. My husband was having an affair. The knowledge settled over me with surprising calm, not the explosive anger or devastating heartbreak I might have expected, but a cold, analytical clarity that felt oddly familiar. It was the same mental state I entered when examining a damaged textile, assessing the extent of the deterioration, understanding the cause of the problem, and beginning to plan the restoration process. Except in this case, the damage might be irreparable, and the restoration might require tools I'd never used before. I needed to confront him, but I also needed to be smart about it. Accusations without proof could be deflected or denied. Emotional reactions could be dismissed as insecurity or jealousy. If I was going to have this conversation, I needed to approach it with the same methodical preparation I brought to my professional work. The confrontation would happen, but it would happen on my terms, with my questions prepared and my evidence organized. If Bryce thought he could manage this situation the way he managed his business crises, he was about to discover that his wife had learned a few things about strategic planning over the years. The marriage I'd thought was solid had revealed its fundamental instability. Now it was time to determine whether the foundation could be repaired, or whether it was time to start planning for demolition. I chose Saturday afternoon for the confrontation, timing it for after Bryce's morning workout, but before his mysterious dinner reservation at Le Pigeon. He was in the kitchen making coffee when I approached him with the calm, measured demeanor I'd practiced the night before. "We need to talk," I said, settling into the chair across from him at our breakfast table. He looked up from his phone with the slightly annoyed expression he'd been wearing whenever I interrupted his activities lately. "Can it wait? I've got calls to make before tonight." "No, it can't wait, and I already know about tonight." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of awareness that this wasn't going to be a routine domestic conversation. He set down his phone and gave me his full attention for the first time in weeks. "Know about what?" "Your dinner reservation. Le Pigeon, 8 o'clock, party of 2. The hostess called to confirm, and Antoinette took the message." I watched his face carefully as I delivered this information, looking for the tells I'd learned to recognize during 8 years of marriage. The slight tightening around his eyes when he was calculating his response, the way his jaw shifted when he was deciding between truth and strategic omission. "Right," he said finally. "I was planning to surprise you. Thought we could use a nice evening out." "With someone who's allergic to shellfish?" The question caught him off guard. His carefully constructed explanation faltered as he realized I had more information than he'd anticipated. "I don't understand." "The restaurant received a call from a young woman requesting no shellfish in any of the courses. Since I'm the one with the shellfish allergy, and I didn't call the restaurant, I'm curious who might have made that request on my behalf." Bryce stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Deny everything and hope I didn't have additional evidence? Admit to part of the truth and try to control the narrative? Or come clean entirely and face the consequences? He chose the middle path, as I'd expected he would. "Okay, you're right. The reservation isn't for us. It's a business dinner with Antoinette Blake. We're meeting to finalize the contract details for her father's hotel project. At the most romantic restaurant in Portland. It was her suggestion. She said her father always conducts important business negotiations at upscale establishments. Something about the psychology of luxury environments making people more likely to agree to favorable terms. Even as he said it, I could tell he didn't fully believe his own explanation. But he pressed forward, committed now to this version of events. I should have told you about it, but I didn't want you to worry about the cost. Le Pigeon isn't cheap, and I know you've been concerned about our expenses lately. Have I been concerned about our expenses? Well, not specifically, but I thought you might be, with the house payments and your museum salary being what it is. There it was, the subtle dig at my career that had become increasingly common in recent months. My work wasn't financially significant enough to matter. My contributions weren't substantial enough to justify an opinion about how our money was spent. Bryce, I said quietly, how long have you been sleeping with her? The directness of the question stripped away all the careful maneuvering and strategic deflection. For a moment, his face showed pure shock, not at being caught, but at being confronted so bluntly. That's not, he started, then stopped. Rosalind, you're making this into something it isn't. How long? It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his tell for being backed into a corner. When he looked up at me again, his expression had changed from defensive to something approaching pity. We need to be honest with each other, he said, about what this marriage has become, about whether we're both getting what we need from it. The shift in tactics was so smooth, it might have worked on someone who hadn't spent years watching him handle difficult clients. Turn the conversation away from his behavior and toward broader relationship issues. Make it a mutual problem requiring mutual solutions. I'm listening. We've grown apart, Roz. You have to see that. When was the last time we had a real conversation about anything other than schedules and household logistics? When was the last time you seemed genuinely interested in my work, or I felt excited to share something with you? Is that why you're having an affair? I'm not, he stopped, seeming to realize that denial was no longer sustainable. It's not about sex, it's about connection, about feeling valued and appreciated and alive. And I don't make you feel alive? You make me feel like I'm disappointing you constantly, like nothing I do is quite right or quite enough. Antoinette listens to my ideas and gets excited about them. She makes me feel like I'm capable of great things instead of just managing decline. The words hit with surgical precision because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. Our conversations had become routine. I had been critical of some of his business decisions, particularly the ones that seemed to prioritize flash over substance. I had stopped pretending to be fascinated by client stories I'd heard variations of dozens of times before. But what he was describing wasn't the natural evolution of a mature relationship. It was his justification for abandoning that relationship in favor of something newer and more flattering to his ego. How long? I asked again. Does it matter? It matters to me. He was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window toward the garden we'd planted together 3 springs ago. Since November. 3 months. While I'd been worrying about the subtle changes in his behavior, planning our Christmas celebrations, and working on the exhibition that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of my professional achievements, he'd been building an entirely separate emotional life with someone else. Are you in love with her? Another long pause. Yes. The single word dropped between us like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread and spread until they reached the edges of everything we'd built together. And what do you want to do about that? I want a divorce. There it was. Not a request for marriage counseling or a trial separation or any of the other intermediate steps that couples sometimes use to address serious problems. A direct statement of intent that left no room for negotiation or compromise. Because I'm too old to make you feel alive? Because we want different things now. Because you're 35 and settled into routines and traditions, and I'm not ready to accept that this is all there is. The age comment landed like a slap. Not just the dismissive tone, but the implication that 35 was somehow past the age when a woman could be exciting or desirable or worthy of effort. Antoinette is 22. It's not about her age. What is it about? She sees possibilities where you see limitations. She's excited about the future instead of nostalgic about the past. She makes me want to be better instead of constantly reminding me of ways I could improve. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the full scope of what he was telling me. Not just that he wanted to end our marriage, but that he'd already constructed an elaborate narrative in which I was the problem, the anchor holding him back from achieving his full potential. So you've already decided? I think we both know this hasn't been working for a while. Have we both known that? Come on, Roz, you can't tell me you've been happy either. The assumption in his voice, that of course I'd been equally dissatisfied, that of course this was a mutual recognition rather than a unilateral decision, revealed how little attention he'd been paying to my actual experience of our relationship. When do you want me to move out? I'll move out. This is your house more than mine anyway. You're the one who chose it, designed the renovations, made it what it is. Even his generosity felt like dismissal. The house wasn't a shared accomplishment, but evidence of my excessive attachment to material things and domestic projects. I'll find an apartment this week, he continued. We can work out the details through lawyers. Keep it civilized. Civilized. As if 8 years of marriage could be dissolved with the same professional courtesy he brought to ending consulting contracts. I nodded once and stood up from the table. The conversation was over, our marriage was over, and the life I'd spent 8 years building had just been dismantled with the efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Enjoy your dinner tonight, I said, walking toward the kitchen door. Rosalind. I turned back to look at him one final time. He was sitting in our restored kitchen, surrounded by the careful beauty I'd created to support his ambitions and reflect our shared success, about to leave it all behind for the promise of feeling young and exciting again. I hope she's worth it, I said, and meant it. Because soon enough, he was going to discover exactly how much his pursuit of youth and excitement was going to cost him. The silence that followed Bryce's confession felt different from any quiet moment we'd shared in 8 years of marriage. Not the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other, but the hollow quiet of a space where something essential had been removed. I sat alone in our kitchen after he left for his romantic dinner, surrounded by the carefully chosen details of a life that had just been declared insufficient by the person I'd built it with. But instead of the devastation I might have expected, I felt something unexpected settling over me: clarity. For months, I'd been trying to understand why my husband seemed increasingly distant and critical, why conversations felt strained and his attention seemed perpetually elsewhere, why I felt like I was constantly falling short of standards that kept shifting beyond my reach. Now I knew. The problem hadn't been my failings as a wife or partner. The problem was that Bryce had already mentally ended our marriage and had been building his case for why I deserved to be discarded. Every criticism, every dismissive comment, every instance of making me feel boring or limiting had been part of a sustained campaign to justify what he'd already decided to do. The knowledge was liberating in a way I hadn't anticipated. I walked through our house methodically, seeing it with new eyes, not as the home we'd created together, but as the stage set for a performance that was about to end. The restored Victorian details I'd researched and implemented, the furniture I'd chosen and arranged, the art I'd selected and hung, the garden I'd planned and planted, all of it evidence of work and care and vision that Bryce had been happy to benefit from while attributing none of the effort or expertise to me. In my basement studio, I looked at the textile collection I'd been cataloging with the same analytical detachment. Each piece told a story of women who had poured skill and creativity into objects meant to last generations, only to have their work eventually end up in museum collections because no one in their families understood their value anymore. But this wasn't going to be that story. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found my sister Elena's number. If Bryce wanted to keep this civilized and handle everything through lawyers, then I was going to make sure I had the right lawyer. "Elena," I said when she answered, "I need to hire you."
What's wrong? Her voice immediately shifted into the protective mode I remembered from childhood, when she'd positioned herself between me and anything that threatened to hurt her older sister. Bryce is having an affair and wants a divorce. He seems to think it's going to be a simple, amicable dissolution of assets. The pause that followed told me Elena was processing both the personal and professional implications of what I'd just said. How amicable is he expecting this to be? He's planning to move out this week and suggested we work out the details through lawyers. He wants to keep it civilized. And how are you feeling about keeping it civilized? I considered the question carefully. How was I feeling? Hurt, certainly. Betrayed, obviously. But underneath those expected emotions was something harder and more determined. I'm feeling like he's made some assumptions about how this process is going to go that may not prove accurate. Elena's laugh was sharp and satisfied. Now you're talking like a Gilmore. What do you need from me? I need to understand exactly what I'm entitled to, what he's entitled to, and what options I have for making sure this divorce reflects the actual value of what I'm bringing to the marriage dissolution. Are we talking about hidden assets? Not hidden exactly, more like undervalued. I spent the next hour on the phone with Elena, walking through the details of our financial situation, property ownership, and the various ways that Bryce's assumptions about our asset division might prove optimistic from his perspective. By the time we finished talking, I had a much clearer picture of the legal landscape ahead. One more thing, Elena said before we hung up. I think Jamie should be involved in this. Your son? But he's so young. He's young, but he's brilliant, and he specializes in exactly these kinds of cases: complex asset division, business valuation, cases where one spouse has been systematically undervalued or marginalized. I thought about my nephew Jamie, remembering his precocious intelligence and unusual maturity. At 26, he already had a reputation for taking on cases that older lawyers avoided because they were too complicated or contentious. Plus, Elena continued, he has something most divorce lawyers don't have. What's that? Personal investment in making sure you're protected. He's been watching Bryce dismiss you at family gatherings for years. This case would be very personally satisfying for him to handle. That evening, I made a series of phone calls. First to Dr. Louisa Armand in Seattle, who listened to my situation with the calm attention of someone who'd been through her own version of this story. The most important thing, she told me, is to document everything before he realizes you're not going to be the passive victim he's expecting. Men like Bryce tend to get very creative with asset management once they understand they're not in complete control of the narrative. Next, I called Edith Nelson, my private investigator friend, who was even more direct. How much documentation do you need, and how quickly do you need it? I don't know yet, but I want to be prepared for any version of this story he might try to tell. Consider it done. I'll start with financial records and work from there. Does he know you're taking this approach? He thinks I'm a 35-year-old museum worker who's going to be grateful for whatever settlement he deems fair. Then he's in for a surprise. Finally, I called Jamie directly. Aunt Rosalind, he said, his voice warming with genuine affection. Mom told me about the situation. I'm so sorry this is happening. Are you available to take on a new client? For you? Absolutely. When can we meet? How about tomorrow morning? I have some documents I'd like you to review. I'll clear my schedule. After the calls were finished, I sat in Bryce's abandoned office, looking at the space he'd cleared of anything incriminating. He'd been methodical about removing evidence, but he'd also been careless about underestimating me. The same dismissive attitude that had allowed him to justify his affair had also prevented him from recognizing that his wife might be capable of strategic thinking. That night, as I lay alone in our bedroom, listening to Bryce return from his romantic dinner with Antoinette, I felt calm for the first time in months. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I finally understood what the situation actually was. My husband had decided I was too old to be worth his continued attention.
He'd found someone younger and more flattering to his ego, and he expected me to quietly accept whatever terms he offered for ending our marriage. What he didn't know was that the woman he'd dismissed as boring and limiting had spent 8 years building relationships with some of the most formidable legal and investigative minds in Portland. He didn't know that my hobby work with historical documentation had taught me skills that would prove very relevant to documenting his recent activities. And he definitely didn't know that his wife's family had produced 3 generations of lawyers who didn't believe in letting anyone get away with underestimating a Gilmore woman. Bryce had been planning his exit strategy for months. Now it was time for me to plan mine. The strategic silence he interpreted as acceptance was actually preparation. And by the time he realized the difference, it would be too late for him to change the terms of engagement. Sunday morning brought the first test of my new resolve. Bryce appeared in the kitchen looking refreshed and energetic in a way I hadn't seen in months, the obvious aftermath of an evening that had gone exactly as he'd hoped. He moved through our space with casual ownership, making coffee and checking his phone while humming softly under his breath. "Good morning," he said when he noticed me at the breakfast table. His tone was friendly but distant, the way you might greet a roommate whose lease was about to expire. "Morning," I replied, not looking up from the documents I was reviewing. Financial statements, property records, and tax returns spread across the surface in organized stacks. "What's all this?" "Just getting organized. If we're going to dissolve the marriage, I want to make sure I understand exactly what we're dissolving." He paused in pouring his coffee, and I can feel his attention sharpening as he took in the scope of the paperwork surrounding me. "You don't need to worry about the details, Roz. I'll handle everything. Make sure you're taken care of." The patronizing tone might have worked on the woman who'd signed divorce papers without reading them in his imagined version of this story, but that woman no longer existed. "I appreciate that, but I'd prefer to handle my own interests. I've retained counsel." "You hired a lawyer?" The surprise in his voice suggested he'd expected me to simply accept whatever arrangement he proposed. "Elena is representing me." "Your sister? Isn't that a bit aggressive for what should be a straightforward process?" Aggressive? Because wanting professional legal representation during a divorce was somehow unreasonable rather than prudent? "I think it's appropriate," I said calmly. "Elena recommended I also work with her son Jamie. Apparently, he specializes in complex asset division cases." Something flickered across Bryce's expression, the first hint that this process might not unfold exactly as he'd anticipated. "Jamie's awfully young to be handling something this important." "He's 26 and already has a reputation for being exceptionally thorough with financial documentation. Elena says he's particularly good at identifying assets that might be overlooked in standard divorce proceedings." I watched Bryce process this information, seeing him calculate what overlooked assets might mean for his carefully planned exit strategy. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we all want to make sure everything is handled properly." "Exactly." After Bryce left for his morning workout, I continued my systematic review of our shared financial life. 8 years of marriage had created a complex web of joint accounts, shared investments, and intermingled assets that would require careful untangling. But as I worked through the documents, patterns began to emerge that painted a very different picture from the one Bryce had been presenting. Our house, for instance, had been purchased with a significant down payment from my family trust, money I'd contributed without seeking credit or recognition because I'd assumed we were building something together. The mortgage payments came from our joint account, but the property taxes and insurance had always been paid from an account funded primarily by my museum salary and trust distributions. The furniture and artwork throughout the house represented thousands of dollars in purchases I'd made over the years, often with my own money from consulting work I did for private collectors. Bryce had been happy to enjoy the beautiful home these purchases had created, but he'd never contributed to or even acknowledged the investment they represented. Most significantly, I'd been the primary financial manager throughout our marriage. Bryce earned more, but I handled budgets, investments, and long-term planning. I'd been the one to set up our retirement accounts, research our insurance policies, and manage the various financial instruments that had allowed us to build wealth while maintaining our lifestyle. The man who dismissed me as financially irrelevant had actually been dependent on my management for most of our shared financial success.
By 10 o'clock, I'd assembled a comprehensive picture of our marital assets that revealed just how much Bryce's fair settlement assumptions might cost him. At 11, Jamie arrived for our scheduled meeting. My nephew had inherited the Gilmore height and the Jerome bone structure, creating an appearance that was both youthful and authoritative. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with his dark hair styled in a way that managed to look both professional and slightly rebellious, he could have been mistaken for a successful entrepreneur rather than a divorce attorney, which, I realized, might prove to be a significant advantage in the coming proceedings. "Aunt Rosalind," he said, embracing me with genuine warmth before shifting seamlessly into professional mode. "I've reviewed the preliminary information Mom shared with me. Before we dive into specifics, I want you to know that I'm going to be completely straightforward with you about your options, even if some of them might feel aggressive." "I appreciate directness." "Good, because based on what I'm seeing, your husband may have significantly underestimated both your financial contributions to this marriage and your legal options for protecting those contributions." We spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of our financial situation in detail. Jamie's questions were precise and comprehensive, revealing knowledge of asset protection strategies and divorce law that would have impressed lawyers twice his age. "The house situation alone is fascinating," he said, making notes in his leather portfolio. "Your trust contributions, combined with your ongoing management of the property expenses, create a very strong argument for disproportionate ownership despite the joint mortgage." "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means that instead of a 50-50 split, you might be entitled to somewhere between 65 and 75% of the property value, depending on how aggressively we want to pursue documentation of your contributions." "And how aggressively do you recommend pursuing it?" Jamie's smile was sharp and satisfied. "That depends on how reasonable your husband wants to be during negotiations." We established a strategy that was both comprehensive and flexible. Jamie would handle all direct communication with Bryce's legal representation, while I continued documenting our financial history with the assistance of Edith Nelson's investigative services. If Bryce wanted to maintain his narrative about keeping things civilized, we'd work within that framework. If he chose to become difficult, we had options for making the process significantly more expensive and complicated for him. "One more thing," Jamie said as we concluded our meeting. "Mom mentioned that your husband's girlfriend might be someone I know professionally. Antoinette Blake, right? You know her? Her uncle's firm handles some of the corporate law for our biggest clients. I've seen her at a few industry functions. She's memorable." Something in his tone suggested the memories weren't entirely professional in nature. "Is that going to be a problem?" "On the contrary, it might be helpful. If she's going to be part of your husband's emotional and financial decision-making going forward, it's useful for me to understand her background and motivations." "What kind of background?" "Let's just say her reputation in legal circles is more about her social connections than her business acumen. She tends to be very focused on lifestyle and status symbols, not necessarily the most practical influence on someone making major financial decisions during a divorce." After Jamie left, I sat in our living room surrounded by the evidence of 8 years spent building what I'd thought was a partnership. But instead of sadness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Bryce had initiated this divorce believing he held all the advantages. He had the higher income, the business connections, and the assumption that his wife would be grateful for whatever he chose to offer. He'd calculated that his pursuit of a younger woman would cost him some money and temporary inconvenience, but nothing that would significantly impact his long-term plans. What he hadn't calculated was that his wife had her own connections, her own expertise, and her own very clear ideas about what constituted fair compensation for 8 years of marriage to a man who'd decided she was too old to deserve his continued attention. The arsenal was assembled, the strategy was in place, and the war he'd started by dismissing me as irrelevant was about to begin in earnest. The following Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my museum office. Dr. Hans Jerome knocked on my door, his expression carrying excitement mixed with concern. "Rosalind, there's someone here to see you." Behind him stood Victoria Jerome Blake,
tall, elegant, with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit that suggested both wealth and serious purpose. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most formidable person in any room. "Mrs. Popplewell, I'm Victoria Jerome Blake," she said, extending a manicured hand. "Jamie's grandmother and senior partner at Morrison, Blake and Associates." We found a quiet corner in the museum's cafe, where Victoria ordered black coffee and got straight to the point. "Jamie tells me your husband has been remarkably foolish about both his personal choices and his assumptions regarding your likely response to those choices." That's one way to put it. Men of his generation often are. They mistake compliance for weakness and confuse courtesy for lack of intelligence. It's a costly error. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "I'm particularly interested in this Antoinette Blake situation." "You know her?" "I know her family. Her father owns a moderately successful hotel chain. Her uncle is a competent enough lawyer, though not particularly imaginative." The assessment was delivered with clinical precision. The interesting thing about young women like Antoinette is how quickly their attention shifts when presented with more attractive options. Loyalty isn't typically their strongest characteristic. "Are you recommending that I use your grandson as bait?" "I'm observing that Antoinette Blake has a predictable pattern of behavior, and that Jamie's involvement in your case presents interesting possibilities for how that pattern might manifest." Victoria hadn't built a successful law firm by being sentimental about tactics. "What does Jamie think about this strategy?" "Jamie thinks it's brilliant, though he's pretending to be offended by the suggestion that he'd use his considerable personal assets for professional advantage." Victoria's smile suggested she wasn't fooled by her grandson's protests. We spent another hour discussing strategy, and I found myself impressed by Victoria's combination of legal expertise and psychological insight. "The key is to let your husband believe he's controlling the narrative while we control the actual circumstances. Men like Bryce need to feel clever and decisive. We can accommodate that need while ensuring the decisions he makes serve our interests rather than his." "One final thought," Victoria said as she gathered her things. "Your husband made a critical error when he assumed you'd be passive during this process. That error is going to cost him considerably more than he's prepared to pay." The opportunity to implement Victoria's strategy arrived sooner than anticipated. On Thursday afternoon, Jamie called with news that would accelerate our timeline considerably. "Bryce's lawyer wants to meet next week to discuss preliminary settlement terms," he said. "Apparently, your husband is eager to move things along quickly." "How quickly?" "He's proposing a meeting for Monday morning. His attorney, David Morrison, seems to think this can all be resolved in a single session." The presumption was breathtaking. 8 years of marriage dissolved in one meeting because Bryce was impatient to formalize his new relationship. "Morrison is competent but old school," Jamie explained. "He tends to approach divorce cases like business transactions, identify assets, split them according to standard formulas, file the paperwork. And that approach won't work here because this isn't a standard case. Your financial contributions were significantly more complex than typical spousal arrangements, and your husband's behavior creates opportunities for claims that go well beyond simple asset division." Jamie explained that Morrison's rush to settle suggested Bryce had presented the divorce as straightforward: two professionals who'd grown apart, mutually agreeing to separate with minimal complications. "I'm going to suggest the meeting take place at their offices. Morrison likes his conference room because he thinks the intimidation factor gives him an advantage." "Will it?" "Not with me, and definitely not if you're there. I want you present for the initial meeting. Let them see exactly who they're dealing with." We scheduled the meeting for Monday at 10 o'clock. Morrison, Blake & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of one of Portland's most prestigious downtown buildings. Jamie picked me up Monday morning in his Mercedes, a detail I noticed because it was exactly the kind of car that would catch Antoinette's attention. "Is there any chance Bryce will bring Antoinette?" I asked. "Clients sometimes bring emotional support to divorce proceedings, though it's generally not recommended because it can complicate negotiations." But if she were there, then she'd have the opportunity to observe how these kinds of legal proceedings actually work. Educational experience for someone who might be facing similar circumstances in the future. We arrived 15 minutes early, Jamie's strategy for claiming psychological territory. At exactly 10 o'clock, we heard voices in the hallway. David Morrison's gravelly baritone, Bryce's familiar cadence pitched higher with nervousness, and a third voice, definitely female, definitely young. "It looks like your husband decided to bring his girlfriend after all," Jamie observed quietly. The door opened and David Morrison entered first, followed by Bryce, and finally, Antoinette Blake stepped into the conference room. When Antoinette's gaze fell on my nephew, I watched her expression shift through surprise, appreciation, interest, and calculation as she assessed this new element. "Ms. Blake," Jamie said, standing with professional courtesy, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I've heard a great deal about your work in hospitality consulting." The meeting was about to begin, but the real drama was already unfolding. The preliminary pleasantries lasted exactly as long as David Morrison needed to establish his position as the senior attorney controlling the proceedings. He gestured for everyone to take seats around the polished conference table. "Before we begin," Morrison said, opening a leather portfolio, "I want to establish that we're all here in the spirit of reaching an amicable resolution. Bryce and Rosalind have built a good life together, and while that chapter is ending, there's no reason the conclusion can't be mutually beneficial." Jamie nodded politely while making notes with an expensive Montblanc pen, another detail that wouldn't escape Antoinette's attention. "My client is prepared to be generous," Morrison continued, sliding a document across the table. "This preliminary settlement offer reflects Bryce's desire to ensure Rosalind's continued financial security." I watched Jamie's expression as he scanned the document. His face remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "This is certainly a starting point for discussion," Jamie said diplomatically, "though I think there are some significant areas where our understanding of the marital assets differs from what's outlined here." "Such as?" Morrison's tone carried the confidence of a man who didn't expect surprises from a lawyer young enough to be his grandson. "The property valuation, for instance. This assessment appears to be based on the original purchase price rather than current market value, and it doesn't account for the substantial improvements Mrs. Popplewell funded and managed." Bryce shifted uncomfortably. He'd clearly presented our home renovations as joint investments, rather than projects I'd researched, planned, and largely financed myself. Additionally, the investment portfolio division doesn't reflect Mrs. Popplewell's primary role in managing these accounts, or her family trust contributions that provided the initial capital. I watched Antoinette's attention shift between the legal discussion and her growing focus on Jamie himself. She was following the financial complexities well enough to understand that significant money was at stake, but she was also studying my nephew with the intensity of someone reassessing her current situation. "There seem to be some misunderstandings about the financial arrangements," replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "An excellent suggestion," Jamie agreed. "I've prepared a comprehensive analysis of the marital assets, including documentation of individual contributions, management responsibilities, and current fair market valuations." He opened his briefcase and extracted a bound report that was easily 3 times the thickness of Morrison's preliminary settlement offer. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. As the meeting continued, I noticed Antoinette lingering near Jamie as everyone prepared to leave. "That was an impressive presentation," she said to Jamie, her voice carrying just enough admiration to be noticeable. "You must have spent considerable time preparing for today." "Thorough preparation is essential in cases like this," Jamie replied, giving her his full attention. "Complex asset situations require careful analysis to ensure fair outcomes for all parties." "I can see that. It must be fascinating work, dealing with such intricate financial arrangements." Bryce, gathering his materials and eager to leave what had become an unexpectedly challenging meeting, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents developing between his girlfriend and opposing counsel. 2 weeks later, the second meeting took place under circumstances none of us had fully anticipated. Morrison had requested additional time to review Jamie's documentation, which had apparently revealed financial complexities that required consultation with forensic accountants. "They're stalling," Jamie explained. "Morrison realizes he significantly underestimated both your contributions and our willingness to document them thoroughly." Through Edith Nelson's discreet inquiries, we'd learned that Bryce's consulting firm was facing challenges. Two major clients had terminated their contracts, citing concerns about leadership stability and personal conduct issues. More interestingly, Antoinette had been making inquiries about Jamie through mutual professional contacts. The second meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. We arrived to find the same conference room, but the atmosphere felt notably different. Morrison appeared less confident, Bryce seemed agitated, and Antoinette looked like someone who had been doing considerable thinking. "Before we begin today's discussion," Morrison said, "I want to address some concerns that have arisen regarding the scope of this proceeding." "What kind of concerns?" Jamie asked. "My client feels that the investigative activities mentioned in our previous meeting may be overreaching the boundaries of what's necessary for asset division. Could you be more specific about which investigative activities are causing concern?" "Financial record analysis, communication monitoring, and what appears to be surveillance of personal activities. All of which fall well within standard practice for complex divorce proceedings where there are questions about asset disclosure and marital misconduct." I watched Antoinette's reaction with growing fascination. Rather than appearing concerned about investigative scrutiny that might affect her relationship with Bryce, she seemed primarily focused on observing how Jamie handled the challenging questions. "My client is prepared to significantly improve his settlement offer in exchange for agreement to limit the scope of discovery," Morrison said. Jamie reviewed the revised document quickly. "This is certainly progress, though there are still areas where our valuations differ substantially." "Such as?" "The business assets, primarily. Mr. Popplewell's consulting firm has been built significantly through contacts and opportunities that Mrs. Popplewell facilitated. The goodwill value of those relationships should be reflected in any settlement. Additionally, there's the matter of spousal support. Given the circumstances surrounding the marriage dissolution and the disparity in future earning potential, Mrs. Popplewell is entitled to ongoing support that reflects not just her financial needs, but the opportunity costs she's incurred." "Furthermore," Jamie said, producing another document, "we've documented a pattern of financial behavior that raises questions about Mr. Popplewell's commitment to transparent asset disclosure. Restaurant charges, jewelry purchases, and travel expenses that don't correlate with documented business activities. The pattern suggests systematic use of marital assets to fund the extramarital relationship." The silence that followed was deafening, but it was Antoinette's reaction that interested me most. Rather than appearing upset about the exposure of Bryce's deception, she looked impressed by Jamie's thoroughness and strategic thinking. As the meeting concluded, I noticed Antoinette maneuvering to position herself near Jamie. "Your analysis of the business relationships was particularly insightful," she said. "I work in hospitality consulting myself, so I understand how valuable those kinds of strategic connections can be. Complex business relationships require careful analysis to ensure fair valuations," Jamie replied, giving her his full attention while maintaining perfect professional appropriateness. Bryce seemed oblivious to the fact that his girlfriend was actively flirting with opposing counsel. The call came at 7:30 on a Friday evening, just as I was finishing dinner alone in the kitchen where this entire ordeal had begun. Jamie's voice carried an unusual note of excitement that immediately caught my attention. "We need to meet tomorrow morning," he said without preamble. "Something significant has happened." "What kind of something?" "The kind that changes everything. Can you be at my office by 9? I arrived to find Jamie pacing behind his desk with the restless energy of someone who'd been up most of the night processing new information. His usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of the late evening he'd spent, his tie slightly loosened, his hair bearing the evidence of frustrated fingers running through it. "Antoinette called me last night," he said, "at 11:15 on my personal cell phone." The implications were immediately clear. She'd somehow obtained his private number and had chosen to contact him well outside normal business hours. What did she want? Officially, she had questions about the divorce process, concerns about how the proceedings might affect her relationship with Bryce. Jamie's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the hint of satisfaction in his voice. Unofficially, she wanted to know if I was available for dinner this weekend. "And what did you tell her?" I told her that direct communication between opposing parties and counsel was highly irregular, but that if she had legitimate concerns about the legal process, I'd be happy to address them in a professional context. Meaning? Meaning, I suggested she might benefit from understanding how complex asset division actually works, particularly in cases involving business partnerships and extramarital relationships. The strategic brilliance was elegant. Jamie had positioned himself as a source of valuable information while maintaining perfect ethical boundaries, creating circumstances where Antoinette would need to seek him out for additional conversations. She agreed to meet you. She suggested coffee this morning, said she wanted to better understand what Bryce might be facing financially so she could be supportive during what she called this difficult transition. The timing was perfect. While Bryce spent his Saturday morning at the gym, convinced his girlfriend was loyally supporting him through his divorce proceedings, she would actually be gathering intelligence from his opponent while evaluating her romantic alternatives. How are you planning to handle the meeting? Very carefully. I'll provide general information about divorce proceedings that's available to anyone, while making it clear that I can't discuss specifics of your case. But I'll also make sure she understands exactly what financial exposure Bryce is facing. At 10:15, Jamie called with a preliminary report from his coffee meeting with Antoinette. She's even more calculating than Victoria predicted, he said. She spent the first 20 minutes asking detailed questions about asset division, spousal support, and timeline expectations. She wanted to know if Bryce's business could be significantly impacted by the settlement. What did you tell her? I explained that divorce proceedings often affect business valuations, especially when marital assets were used to build professional relationships. I also mentioned that ongoing support obligations can substantially impact future cash flow. How did she react? Like someone rapidly recalculating the financial benefits of her current relationship choices. The conversation had lasted 2 hours, during which Antoinette had revealed considerably more about her motivations than she'd probably intended. Her questions focused heavily on monetary implications rather than emotional concerns. She'd asked about Jamie's own career prospects, his family background, and whether he handled other types of legal work beyond divorce cases. She also asked if I was single, Jamie added with obvious amusement, said she was curious about whether lawyers ever dated clients, then quickly clarified that she meant former clients after proceedings were concluded. And I told her that would depend entirely on the specific circumstances and the people involved. By Saturday evening, the foundation of Bryce's new relationship was already showing stress fractures. Antoinette had returned from her coffee meeting with Jamie noticeably distracted, checking her phone frequently and showing less interest in Bryce's attempts to discuss their future plans. The first revelation had been delivered, and its effects were spreading through Bryce's carefully constructed new life with the inexorable force of water finding every crack in a failing foundation. Monday morning brought confirmation that the weekend's developments had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. Jamie called before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. Morrison wants an emergency meeting, today if possible. What kind of emergency? The kind where his client suddenly realizes he's in serious financial trouble and needs to reassess his negotiating position. Apparently, Bryce had spent his Sunday evening reviewing Jamie's asset documentation with growing alarm. The combination of business valuation adjustments, spousal support calculations, and potential misconduct penalties had painted a picture of financial exposure that far exceeded his initial expectations. He's also having problems with Antoinette, Jamie added. Morrison mentioned that she's been asking uncomfortable questions about the timeline for settlement and whether Bryce might need to liquidate assets to meet his obligations. The domino effect was accelerating. Antoinette's coffee meeting with Jamie had provided her with enough information to understand that her future with Bryce might be significantly less financially secure than she'd anticipated. Her subsequent questions to Bryce had apparently revealed the extent of her concern about his deteriorating position. Morrison's proposing a substantially revised offer, Jamie continued, one that suggests they're finally taking our position seriously. We met that afternoon in the same conference room where this process had begun, but the power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Morrison appeared tired and slightly defeated, while Bryce looked like someone who hadn't slept well in several days. Most telling of all, Antoinette was notably absent. "Where's your emotional support?" Jamie asked pleasantly as we settled around the table. "Miss Blake had other commitments today," Bryce replied stiffly, though the tension in his voice suggested there was more to her absence than scheduling conflicts. The new settlement offer was comprehensive and significantly more generous than previous proposals. Property division that reflected my actual contributions, spousal support that acknowledged opportunity costs, even provisions for legal fees and investigation expenses. "This is much more reasonable," Jamie said after reviewing the terms, though I notice there's no admission of misconduct or acknowledgement of the circumstances that necessitated formal proceedings. "My client maintains that the marriage dissolution was the result of mutual incompatibility rather than any specific wrongdoing," Morrison replied carefully. "I see. And how does he explain the systematic use of marital assets to fund his extramarital activities?" The question hung in the air between them, creating exactly the kind of uncomfortable silence that either forces admissions or reveals the weakness of defensive positions. "Perhaps," Morrison said finally, "we could structure the settlement to address Mrs. Popplewell's concerns without requiring specific admissions about past conduct." It was as close to a confession as we were likely to get, and Jamie accepted it with gracious professionalism. The settlement negotiations concluded with surprising efficiency once Bryce accepted that his initial assumptions about controlling the process had been fundamentally flawed. But the real revelation came 3 days later when Jamie called with news that transformed the entire situation from legal victory to complete vindication. "Antoinette has filed a formal complaint with the Oregon State Bar," he said, his voice mixing professional concern with personal satisfaction. "Against you?" "Against Bryce. She's alleging that he misrepresented his financial position and marriage status when they began their relationship. She's claiming fraud and emotional manipulation." The irony was breathtaking. The woman who had broken up my marriage was now accusing my ex-husband of exactly the kind of deception that had destroyed our relationship. "But there's more," Jamie continued. "She's also requesting my representation in her potential civil case against him." The ultimate truth was emerging with crystalline clarity. Antoinette's interest in Jamie hadn't been merely romantic opportunism, it had been strategic positioning. She'd recognized that aligning herself with superior legal counsel would provide better protection for her interests than remaining loyal to a man whose financial prospects were deteriorating rapidly. "She asked me out again," Jamie added, officially this time, "said she wanted to celebrate the conclusion of your case and discuss her future legal needs." "And?" "I told her I'd be delighted to have dinner with her once all pending legal matters were resolved." The woman who had told Bryce that 35 was too old had just chosen a 26-year-old lawyer over her 38-year-old boyfriend. The woman who had been attracted to Bryce's confidence and success had abandoned him the moment she encountered someone more competent and professionally accomplished. "Bryce called me this morning," Jamie said. "He's requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the bar complaint and potential civil litigation. Apparently, he's concerned about the impact on his consulting business." The cascade of consequences was accelerating beyond anything we'd anticipated. Antoinette's complaint would create a public record of professional misconduct that could destroy Bryce's reputation in Portland's business community. Her potential civil case would expose the financial deception that had characterized his approach to both his marriage and his affair. Most satisfying of all, the man who had left his wife for a younger woman was about to discover that younger women could be remarkably ruthless when their interests were threatened. The ultimate truth was simple. Bryce had assumed he could control everyone in his life through charm, manipulation, and financial advantage. He'd underestimated his wife, dismissed his legal opposition, and misjudged his girlfriend's loyalty. All 3 miscalculations were about to cost him everything he'd valued more than his marriage. The final meeting took place 6 weeks later in the same conference room where this process had begun, though the cast of characters had changed dramatically. Morrison sat across from Jamie, looking every one of his 67 years as he reviewed the comprehensive settlement agreement that would officially end my marriage to Bryce Popplewell. Bryce himself appeared diminished in ways that went beyond the obvious financial stress. His consulting firm had lost 2 more major clients following news of the bar complaint, and the ongoing civil litigation with Antoinette had created a level of professional scrutiny that was proving devastating to his reputation. "My client accepts all terms as outlined," Morrison said wearily: "the property division, spousal support schedule, and legal fee reimbursement." "And the non-disclosure provisions regarding the circumstances of the marriage dissolution?" Jamie asked. "Agreed, with the understanding that this doesn't prevent Miss Blake from pursuing her separate legal actions." The irony was perfect. Bryce would pay handsomely to keep the details of his affair private, but his former girlfriend was ensuring that his misconduct became public record anyway through her fraud allegations. "There is one final matter," Jamie said, producing a document from his briefcase. "Mrs. Gilmore has prepared a statement she'd like read into the record." I'd reclaimed my maiden name the week before, another small symbol of the independence I'd rediscovered through this process. The statements I'd written was brief but comprehensive. "For 8 years, I believed I was building a marriage based on mutual respect and shared values. I supported my husband's career, managed our household, and contributed significantly to our financial success while maintaining my own professional responsibilities. When that marriage ended, I was told that at 35, I was too old to deserve continued love and partnership. Today's settlement reflects the actual value of my contributions and the cost of that dismissal." Morrison read the statement aloud without comment, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of someone who'd presided over too many similar reckonings. "The divorce is granted," he concluded. "All terms are binding as of today's date." As we gathered our materials, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been 8 months ago. Grateful for whatever attention Bryce chose to give me, concerned about being too demanding or difficult, willing to accept his diminishing respect as the natural evolution of a long-term relationship. That woman no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood her own value, who surrounded herself with people who recognized her capabilities, and who would never again accept being treated as disposable. Outside the law offices, Jamie and I walked to his car in comfortable silence. The Portland afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that made the city feel full of possibilities. "Any regrets?" he asked as we reached the Mercedes. I considered the question seriously. 8 years of marriage dissolved. A life I'd carefully built, dismantled, and reconstructed. A man I'd loved revealed as someone capable of remarkable cruelty. "None at all," I said, and meant it completely. The reckoning was complete, and the future belonged entirely to me. 1 year later, I stood in the restored carriage house behind my Victorian home, now converted into a private conservation studio and consulting office. The space reflected everything I'd learned about my own capabilities: professional equipment that rivaled any museum facility, a client consultation area for the private collectors who sought my expertise, and walls lined with certificates from the advanced training programs I'd completed since the divorce. The Gilmore name carried weight in Portland's cultural circles, and I'd finally begun using that weight strategically. My consulting practice specialized in textile authentication for estate planning and insurance purposes, work that commanded fees 3 times what the museum had paid me. More importantly, it connected me with clients who valued expertise and treated knowledge as a precious commodity rather than an amusing hobby. Elena called that afternoon with news that completed the circle of justice in ways I couldn't have imagined a year earlier. "Jamie and Antoinette are engaged," she said, her voice mixing amusement with satisfaction. Apparently, he proposed at the same restaurant where Bryce took her for their first date. The poetic justice was remarkable. The woman who had destroyed my marriage for financial security had found it with the lawyer who had dismantled her lover's assets. The man who had lost his wife to a younger woman had lost that younger woman to an even younger man. How is Bryce handling the news?
About as well as you'd expect. His consulting practice is basically finished. The bar complaint created enough professional damage that most Portland businesses won't work with him. He's apparently moving to Seattle to start over. Starting over at 38 with a damaged reputation and limited resources, the contrast with my own renewal couldn't have been sharper. That evening, I walked through the house that was now entirely mine, seeing it with the appreciation of someone who had nearly lost everything and chosen to fight instead. The restoration work I'd done reflected not just aesthetic vision, but strategic thinking, financial planning, and the kind of long-term commitment that created lasting value. At 36, I wasn't too old for anything. I was experienced enough to recognize quality, confident enough to demand respect, and wise enough to build relationships with people who appreciated strength rather than requiring submission. The museum had offered me the assistant director position, a promotion that acknowledged both my professional growth and the reputation I'd built through private consulting. My calendar was filled with projects that excited me, relationships that energized me, and possibilities that reflected everything I'd learned about my own worth. The woman who had signed divorce papers in stunned silence had evolved into someone who negotiated from positions of strength, surrounded herself with formidable allies, and refused to accept treatment that didn't reflect her actual value. Bryce had been wrong about almost everything, but he'd been most wrong about this. I wasn't damaged goods because I was 35. I was a woman who had spent 35 years learning, growing, and building capabilities that would serve me for the next 50 years. The dawn of my new life wasn't just bright, it was blazing with possibilities I was finally confident enough to seize.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.